So for learning objective 1, we're going to discuss the formative period of the two-party system. That is, we're going to see where the two-party system came from. And the thing we want to remember is that the framers of the Constitution wanted to avoid political parties in the first place. So there were a number of ways they tried to do this with the structure of the government that they created. So yes, the framers thought of factions could be avoided by the mere construction of the government that they created. So part of the reason for the Electoral College, the weirdness of that, was to prevent, in part, political parties from taking over the federal government or having any influence over it. And so the Electoral College delegates, if they saw partisanship run amok, that is, a political party thinking of its own interest before the national interest, the electoral delegates, in theory, could override maybe a vote that was that was clear where a political party was taking over the mechanisms of government. Federal judges are appointed for life, so this was put in and still remains. It's actually a very sound logic to this. You don't want judges presiding over law and imposing judicial review based on the political winds of the time. And so federal judges are definitely insulated from political parties. Now, they are still political animals. You know, there's conservative judges and there are liberal judges, but they don't necessarily have to answer to a political party, whether it be a Democratic Party or a Republican Party. House of Representatives was actually the only part of the Congress, the federal government, that the voter, the eligible voter, had access to. That is, they could vote for these people, and they have to run every 2 years. And so the thinking there is that if a political party did entrench itself in the federal government, it could be cleaned out quite easily because every 2 years these people had to run. The senators, having 6 years terms, the thought there is that they would be more independent. And also, it wasn't until 1913 that, with the 17th Amendment, that the eligible American voter actually could vote for a senator. Senators used to be chosen by state legislatures. And this was seen as a way of, again, insulating them from party politics at that time. So the structure of the government was an attempt to stop political parties from either forming, or if they did form, from at least trying to curtail the power that they might have within the federal government. So the question is what happened? Obviously, this didn't work. We have political parties today, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So what happened? So how did Hamilton cause the formation of political parties? Well, when Hamilton comes up with his ideas on fiscal policy, with the creation of the bank and the assumption of state debts, Jefferson hears this and he does not like the overall objective of where he's going with this, which is to create a stronger government. Right, and Hamilton's idea is this is going to create a sense of nationalism. But let's watch a clip from HBO to see this great quick depiction of how this political rivalry began and how it formed political parties.
You must find Philadelphia much changed, Mr. Jefferson.
More change than I could have imagined, Mr. Hamilton. Not the city itself. All cities swallow everything in their weight.
That's no surprise to me. That's why I abhor them. But I've been, as you know, in revolutionary France, where the streets are filled with the songs of liberty and brotherhood and the overthrow of ancient tyrannies of Europe, and to return from there to this, our cradle of revolution, and find the dinner table chatter is all of money and banks and authority is an unwelcome surprise.
Unwelcome, perhaps, but necessary.
I must admit, Mr. Hamilton, I'm a little uncertain as
to the purpose of the Treasury Department. No doubt its function will reveal itself to me in good time.
The future prosperity of this nation rests chiefly in trade. Trade depends, among other things, on the willingness of other nations to lend us money.
And how would you propose to establish international credit?
Our first step would be to incur a national debt. The greater the debt, the greater the credit. And to that end, I have recommended to the President that Congress adopt all the debts incurred by the individual states during the war through a national bank. The idea being that if the states owe Congress money, then other nations will feel more inclined to lend it to us.
If the states are indebted to a central authority, it increases the power of the central government.
You have it exactly. The greater the government's responsibility, the greater its authority.
The moneyed interest in this country is all in the north, so the wealth and power would inevitably be concentrated there in the federal government, to the expense of the south.
If that is the case, it is unavoidable if the Union is to be preserved.
I fear our revolution will have been in vain if a Virginia farmer is to be held in hock to a New York stock jobber, who in turn is in hock to a London banker. The opportunities for avarice and corruption would certainly prove irresistible.
Well, there you have it, as I have heard said. If men were angels, then no government would be necessary.
So again, out of these concerns, out of Jefferson's and Madison's concerns of where Hamilton was going with assuming the debts of the states to create more power for the federal government and to create a bank where the shares would be open to the public, therefore attracting wealthy investors into the bank. And this would create, and his idea was that if you have wealthy people investing in a federal institution, then wealthy people will begin to think as Americans and not as Southerners or New England men or Westerners or whatever the case may be. As he saw it, and as a lot of the framers of the Constitution or the Founding Fathers saw it, is that the key was to create a sense of nationalism, to create mechanisms for that. The problem is how to go about that. What Jefferson and Madison begin to do is they begin to form a faction within Congress. And so the idea was to create a Republican Party, a Democratic Republican Party within Congress. And it wasn't to leave Congress at this time. But newspapers began to get a hold of these arguments between Hamilton and Jefferson, and they began to pick sides. And out of this, you begin to get the Federalist Party forming to defend itself. And so these parties transcended the Congress, and they became slowly national parties. And these are just a list. We've gone over this before, but just to make sure you still understand it, these are just a basic list, a mere image of what these political parties would stand for, right? Federalists have a loose interpretation of the Constitution. The Democratic Republicans have a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and so on and so forth through this. So keep this in mind as you're looking at later political parties, because the later political parties will all kind of share this dichotomy between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And when John Adams runs for president, he is the first president who is going to have the backing of a political party, the Federalist Party. So by the time we get to a second president, we have a Federalist Party at the helm. And this is going to entrench further this new thing called the Democratic Republicans. And later, Jefferson in the election of 1800 is going to run against John Adams and win that presidency. And we'll talk about that a little bit later.